So we left off yesterday in chapter 2, and we had just started to talk about the different types of ownership estates. Remind me, what did we say an estate was? What does that word mean, an estate?
Relationship.
It's a legal relationship that a person has to a piece of property. And what do we say the two big categories of estates were? You either what? Freehold, which means you what? What's your relationship to the property? You own the property. If you have a freehold interest, you own the property. If you have a non-freehold interest, what's your relationship to that property? You lease it. It's a non-freehold. You lease the property. And we started to break down those freehold interests. We started to break down exactly what it means for someone to have ownership, the different types of ownership. That's where we left off yesterday. And the first thing we talked about with the different types of ownership was something called fee simple absolute. What did we say fee simple absolute ownership was?
No restrictions.
No restrictions. Ownership completely without restrictions as far as the grantor is concerned. The grantor who gave us ownership of the property did not place any restrictions on that ownership. And what are the things that they could possibly restrict? So what's unrestricted about fee simple absolute ownership? Time and use. Is everybody good with that? That's a perfect answer. Time is unrestricted. In other words, we own it forever. And use is unrestricted. And we said this is the vast majority of ownership. Remember, this has nothing to do with whether we owe money on the property. This has nothing to do with whether or not we have covenants or restrictions on the property. It just simply means that the grantor has not placed any restrictions on that ownership. No time restriction, no use restriction. And then we went into the time restrictions. And what do we say restricts time of ownership? The only way you can limit the amount of time somebody owns a property is through what?
Life estate.
A life estate. A life estate is a time limitation, and it's a time limitation based on somebody's life. Who is that somebody? What do we call that person who is the time that determines the amount of time? That is the measuring life. The person who determines the length of time is the measuring life. Now, being the measuring life doesn't get you anything as far as the property is concerned. The measuring life has nothing to do with ownership of the property. They don't get any benefit of owning the property. They don't get any benefit of anything. Their job is to do what? Breathe. That's it. Breathe. Because as long as they're breathing, this life estate is going to continue to exist. But the moment they die, that ownership is going to go away. So if the measuring life doesn't get any benefit of ownership, who does get the benefit of ownership? The life tenant. That's the person who owns the property as long as the measuring life is still alive. Does that make sense for everybody? The life tenant is the owner of the property. And what can they legally do with the property?
Everything.
Everything. Their use is unrestricted. It's only their time that's restricted. So can they sell it?
Yes.
Of course they can. Can they lease it out? Yeah. Can they occupy it themselves? And they make money from it?
Yes.
This is my new student? Come on in. Come on in and have a seat. What's your name?
Jesse.
Jesse?
Yes.
Okay. Jesse. I heard we had a new addition coming. Everybody say hi to Jesse. There you go, your book, and we are in chapter 2 slides. I'm sure Annie will help you find your place there if you don't mind, Annie. So, the life tenant is the person who owns this thing as long as this life estate is going on. What's going to happen at the end of that life estate? Where does it go? Where does the ownership of the property go after the measuring life dies? Because that's when the life estate ends, when the measuring life dies. See, the life tenant has nothing to do with the time, and the measuring life has nothing to do with the ownership. They're separate jobs. Does that make sense for everybody? Where does it go once the measuring life dies?
Depends on the case.
It depends, right? We don't know. We don't know. And see, that should be your first instinct. Go, well, I don't know. You haven't given me enough information. I don't know where this thing is going to go. Where are the two possibilities it could go?
Or
It could go revert back to the original owner. What do we call that?
Probation.
That has nothing to do with conventional.
Oh.
That's a reversionary interest. That's a reversionary interest. If it reverts back to the original grantor, that's the reversionary interest. What's the other option? A remainder man. And that's if the grantor, the original grantor, named where this thing was going to go. That's the other option for where it ends up. And no matter whether it's a reversionary interest or a remainder interest, what kind of ownership is that person going to get? Once the life estate is over, what kind of ownership is the remainder man going to have? Fee simple absolute. Everybody good with that? What kind of interest would a reversionary owner have? Fee simple absolute. Because when the life estate ends, it goes back to fee simple absolute. Is everybody all right with that? Now, Edgar brought up the phrase conventional life estate. See, so far, here's what you need to know about life estates. Forget the conventional and pour out your V stuff until you understand the basics of any life estate. What we were just talking about applies to every single life estate. You always have a measuring life, you always have a life tenant, and you always have one or the other of a reversionary interest or a remainder interest. Is everybody good with me on that? Now, we could break them down and say this is a conventional life estate or this is a life estate pour out your V. What makes the difference between a conventional life estate and a life estate pour out your V? Who is the measuring life and who is the what? Life tenant. If the measuring life and the life tenant are the same person, what kind of life estate do we have? That's a conventional life estate. If they're different people, what do we have? That's a life estate pour out your V. Do they pretty much work the same? Yeah, all the mechanics of the life estate are exactly the same. Whether it's conventional or whether it's pour out your V, it doesn't matter. They're the same. It's just a label we put on it that tells you, is the life tenant and the measuring life the same person or are they two different people? So, if I put it in real world terms, Sergio owns the property until Sergio dies. Who's the life tenant?
Him.
Sergio, right? Him has a name, right? Sergio. Pronouns don't work in this class. That's why I'm so big on names. Because when you start getting into him, he, she, it, you can't tell what the hell you're talking about. Especially on these test questions. I'm not kidding, because they'll give me 15 names on a test question. Oh, well, he said. Who is he? So it's important to really focus in. So who's the life tenant? Sergio. Who's the measuring life? Sergio. So what kind of life estate is that? That's a conventional life estate. And is it one with a reversionary interest or a remainder interest?
Reversionary.
It's reversionary. You do know, because if I don't say, what's the default? What does it do on its own if I don't say where it's going to go? If the grantor doesn't say, it's going to do what? It's going to revert back. So that's a conventional life estate with a reversionary interest. Does that make sense for everybody? Now, if I said Sergio owns it until Catherine dies and then it goes to Freddie, who's the life tenant? Sergio owns it till Catherine dies and then it goes to Freddie. Who's the life tenant? Sergio's the life tenant. Who's the measuring life? Catherine. And so what kind of life estate is that? Is that a conventional or a pour ultra V? That's a pour ultra V life estate. And does it have a remainder interest or a reversionary interest? It has a remainder interest because I said this is what would happen to it after the fact. Oh, is that sort of starting to crystallize a little bit for you? Okay. I know they're tough. I realize that. That's kind of why I wanted to retread them first thing to make sure we're not just leaving them by themselves. And we're going to touch back on them later today as well.
Can I clarify this one thing?
Sure.
You said that a life estate will always end in a fee absolute.
Fee simple absolute.
Fee simple absolute.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It will. Because the only restriction that was placed onto the ownership was this time restriction. So once the life estate ends, the time restriction is gone, and so that means you have no restrictions, and what do we call ownership with no restrictions? That is fee simple absolute. Okay? Good. Good. Today, we want to start off with the other type of limitation that we can have. The other type of limitation that we can have Doesn't limit time, but it limits what? What was the other thing we said we could limit? Use. The grantor, and let's be honest here, this is really all about a grantor who kind of is a control freak, right? All of these things are about somebody who isn't going to own the property anymore, but still wants to have control over the property. I mean, think about it. Normally when you sell a property, when you transfer ownership to somebody, do you give a crap what happens with the property after that? No, but these are grantors who clearly do give a crap about what happens after they've transferred ownership, because they either want to make sure that this person they're granting ownership only owns it for a certain amount of time, or they want to make sure that this person that they're granting ownership to has limited use of the property. Does that make sense for everybody? Now we want to talk about limiting the use. And it's important to always ask yourself the why question. Why? Why would somebody do this? Why would somebody want to limit the use? If you're not going to own the property anymore, why would you want to limit the use? Can you think of it? Can anybody think of a reason? Go ahead, Amanda.
You own the property beside it.
You own the property next door. Would that be a reason? So let's say I own two side-by-side pieces of property, and I live on one of them, and I'm selling the next door property to somebody. Do I have some concerns about what might be done on that next door property?
Yes.
Absolutely. So one of the things I might want to maintain some control over, I might say, sure, I'll sell it to you, but you're not going to be able to do this with it. Does that make sense for everybody? That's a limitation of use. Well, can you think of any other examples of when I might want to limit use before I give ownership to somebody, grant ownership? Don't think of just a sales transaction. Remember, any transfer of ownership. So a gift is also. Yes, go ahead, Mary, or Amanda.
Donating property?
Donating property is another classic example. If you're donating property to somebody, could you donate it to them fee simple absolute? Sure. And then 6 years later, they turn around and sell it for $10 million. Are you going to be pissed? To put it mildly, right? You're going to blow your top from here to kingdom come, because out of the goodness of your heart, you donated this property to somebody for a certain thing, and then they turned around as soon as property values went up and did what? Sold it, cashed out on it. Might you want to prevent that? Might you want to say, I'll be glad to give it to you, but I'm only going to give it to you for this purpose. You can only use it for this purpose. There are lots of reasons that people might want to maintain control even after they don't have ownership. Do you have something about that?
Yes, could you factor in, let's say, for example, if they were going to sell and the property value increased exponentially, would you be able to get a piece of that?
No. No, you don't own it any longer. You don't own it any longer. The only way you have a piece of the action is to have an ownership interest, and you don't have that any longer. But by limiting what their use is of the property, are you not going to dramatically limit what the value of the property is? Because remember, you're not just limiting their use. Who else's use? I'll give you a hint. This restriction would be appurtenant. So who else's use are you limiting?
Everyone who owns.
The next owner, and the next owner, and the next owner. And how long is that restriction going to last? Forever. So once you place that restriction on there, sure, they can sell it, but they can only sell it to the next person to be used for the same thing they were restricted to. Does that make sense for everybody? And so that's going to dramatically limit their ability to sell, especially in the case of like a donated piece of land, because if you say you can only use it for this purpose, then they could sell it, but the next buyer, the next owner would have to only use it for that purpose. Those are called the defeasible fee estates. Let me skip ahead and get to those. The fee simple defeasible estates. Yes?
So are you saying that even if wildfires went through and you could no longer tell where that property is and things like that you still, that would still hold true?
Let me ask you a question. What would a wildfire have to do with not being able to tell where the property is?
Well, I don't know. I'm trying to think of some way that it wouldn't be forever. How could it be forever?
How long does land last? Forever. So any restriction we place on land lasts what? It only lasts as long as the land does. So I'm still curious about the whole wildfire not being able to identify the property anymore. You mean you wouldn't recognize it, or what?
Well, maybe there's not, whatever they use to determine where the land is, it's no longer there. So how would they know?
Are you planning on Armageddon that I don't know about? Do I need to be home like building a bomb shelter somewhere? I mean,
I'm curious as to, you know, rules get broken, so I was just trying to figure out if there is a way.
well, if there's ever a way that we can't determine where property is, trust me, the last thing we'll be concerned about is somebody's fee simple defeasible estate, because we'll all be dead somewhere, so it won't matter. We can tell where the property is. I mean, because we have systems that are designed for that are designed to locate the property exactly, to know exactly where a property is, no matter how much it changes, no matter if the property burns, if there's an earthquake, it's still, because the land is always defined as the surface of the earth, so you can always find that spot on the surface of the earth, and that's the property, and that restriction is going to stay there forever. That's the key to an appurtenance, that it does last forever. All right?
Good question.
Sure.
Can a fee simple defeasible be a part of a life estate?
Can you combine the two? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Sure,
Yeah.
anything's possible.
Like the reversionary interest or the remainder?
Anything's possible.
Okay.
It will not be the case for you on this test,
Okay.
though.
Okay.
And it would also be exceptionally rare to operate that way in the real world.
Okay.
Combining those two would be a very complex thing, and you'd have to have about 16 attorneys involved in doing something like that. But it's possible. I mean, anything is technically possible.
Okay.
All right? Yes, ma'am.
Is the fee simple determinable, or either one actually, is it limiting the purpose, or is it also on like physical things, like say, I only want the person next to me to have a 2-story home? Is that something, or is it just purpose? Like I don't want you to use it as a business?
It's more about purpose.
Okay.
There are better ways to limit, and what you're talking about is more refinement within a purpose. There are better ways to handle that. We're going to talk about covenants in the next section. Covenants are a better way to refine down what certain restrictions are on a property. Fee simple determinable, fee simple subject to a condition, these ones that we're about to talk about are much more driven toward big overarching purposes. That's, you put it as you really stated it in a good way, the purpose. So in other words, if I had fee simple determinable that said you can only use this property for residential purposes, I might also have covenants that say that a house could be no more than 2 stories and has to be this material constructed of, but that would not be part of the fee simple determinable deed. Okay? So let's talk about these two types of limited use. One tells you what you can do, and one tells you what you can't do. One tells you what you can do, and one tells you what you can't do. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. I don't want you to answer it out loud. I want you to turn it over in your brain for a second. Which is worse? Which is more strict? Somebody telling you what you can do, or somebody telling you what you can't do? Now, don't say your answer. Don't say your answer yet, because I want you to think about it this way. A parent sets rules for their child. Which is more strict? You can go to the movie theater and be home by 10 o'clock. Or just don't come home after 10 o'clock. Which is more strict? What you can do or what you can't do? Can't is more strict? Can is much more strict. You can go to the movie theater. How many things can you do? One. You can't come home after 10 o'clock. I would have loved to hear that as a kid. Because the world is your oyster at that point. And no matter what they catch you doing, if it's 9:45, when you only got to say, I'm home by 10, Mom. I mean, you didn't say I couldn't have a car full of strippers and liquor and beer and... You didn't tell me that. You just said you can't come home after 10 o'clock. Does that make sense? So which one is more strict? A grantor who says what you can do with the property, or a grantor who says what you can't do?
What you can.
What you can do. Can is fee simple determinable. This is a grantor who is stating what the next owners can do with the property. They can do this one thing. Miriam, I'm granting you ownership of this property as long as you use it as a park. So how many things can Miriam use the property for? One. And if can she sell the property?
Yes.
Sure, as long as the next owner only uses it as a what? As a park. And here's the teeth of that. Because a lot of people would ask the question, well, so what if she uses something other than a park? What would happen to her ownership if she did stop using it as a park? She would lose title. She would lose ownership. Where would it go?
Fee simple absolute.
It would turn to fee simple absolute, but for who? Where would it go? It would go back to me. The original grantor who put that restriction on the property in the first place. Because I put a protection in there that says, I'm granting you ownership as long as you do this. Well, if she breaks that rule, guess where it's coming back?
To you.
Right back to me. And it's not just if she breaks that rule. If 150 years later, some subsequent owner breaks that rule, what's happening to the ownership?
Goes back to the
It goes back to the original grantor. See, you need to stop saying it goes back to the heirs. You're so focused on people being dead. Stop that. It goes back to the original grantor. You don't know, that person may live to be 300. It goes back to the original grantor. Now, if they happen to be dead, sure, it's going to go to their heirs. But it goes back to the original grantor. Is everybody okay with that? Yes.
I know this might sound stupid. If they break it and it goes back to the original owner or the owner's heirs, is that stipulation still on there?
No.
Does it last forever, or is it?
No. Once it reverts back, it's fee simple absolute. Once it comes back, if it ever comes back, and it'd be very rare that it would come back, because most people are very well aware that they have this restriction on their ownership, so they're not going to risk violating that. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay? That's a fee simple determinable deed. Yes, sir, Fred.
But while it's out there with those restrictions, the grantor cannot change those restrictions.
Correct. They don't have ownership any longer.
It resets once it comes back.
If it comes back.
Right.
And keep in mind, that only happens if the rule is violated. Right? The grantor is not some puppet master who's sitting there the whole time meddling in this thing. They got one shot at making these restrictions. Because once they have made the restriction, what have they done with ownership of the property? I've given it to Marion. I can't change anything about that property. It's not my property any longer.
Right.
Does that make sense for everybody?
Completely.
I can't meddle with her ownership. It's hers. Just like the person who sold me my house can't come back and say, oh, I don't like the color of the door. You need to pay that back. Excuse me, until you can hear a four-letter word.
Yeah.
It's your house.
I think that what you said there makes a good point for me, because it's the ownership that you're dealing with here.
That's right.
So once because that's a legal transaction, that new ownership is new ownership.
That's exactly right.
Contract, legality is broken, then things become reset.
It comes reset. That's it. And but as
Yeah.
long as it's not broken, as long as that promise, that covenant is not broken, then that ownership is going to continue on forever, and the original grantor is never going to have any say-so over that property again.
Got it.
Okay? Yes, Brandon.
So if the grantor puts a restriction, sells a house, and that person wants the restriction lifted, can they talk to the grantor and have it lifted?
They potentially could. So Brandon's question essentially is, if the property gets granted with this kind of a restriction on it, and then subsequently down the road, the new owner of the property wants to essentially lift that restriction, could they discuss with the grantor lifting that restriction? And the answer is yes, but only if that grantor happens to still be alive. Once that grantor dies, then you really lose any ability to change this thing. Does that make sense for everybody?
So it will stay forever.
Forever. It's an appurtenance. It'll be there forever. Yes, ma'am.
But what about if the heirs are?
Doesn't matter. Wasn't there a restriction? The only person who can lift that restriction is who?
the original
The
grantor.
one that put it there.
So if they died and it went back to the heir, then couldn't you buy it back from them?
Well, you can always buy it back from them, but that's got nothing to do with any of this. They can do whatever they want to do. Here's the thing. You're making this way harder than it is because you're running yourself in. I'm not picking on you. You're all doing it. You're running yourself around a rabbit hole. This is a simple thing. There's a rule. You break a rule, what is there? A penalty. Simple as that. There's a rule, there's a penalty. What's the penalty for breaking the rule? You lose ownership of the property, and it goes back to the original line of ownership. Now, if they wanted to be nice and deed it right back over to you, could they?
Yes.
Sure they could. But that's essentially what you're asking me. You're asking me, could they do a bunch of stuff after this thing is already blown up? Of course they could. But the thing is the thing. The thing is simple. It's a restriction placed on the property, and it's going to last how long?
Forever.
Forever. Forever. Your problem, and I mean the royal you, is all of you, is you are trying to make this fit what you see in everyday life. You can't do that. What did I tell you yesterday about ownership? I said 99.5% of the time it's what kind of ownership? Fee simple absolute. So your perspective on ownership is all about fee simple absolute. So you can't take this and try to make it look like what you expect it to look like, because it never will. This is not fee simple absolute. This is much less than fee simple absolute. Is that getting there for you? Because you need to accept that this is designed to be restricted. Stop thinking about how to lift the restrictions and think about what they were designed for. I mean, like even Brandon's question, could you go back to the grantor and get them to lift the restriction? Sure. Guess what? They're going to say, F you. No, I put it there for a reason. I wanted it there. It's not going anywhere. How long is it going to last?
Forever.
Forever. Trust me, you'll learn I'm not really mad. I do that for effect. Because if I get passionate about it, it gets your attention. You would be amazed at the eyes. It's like, it's a great tool. I don't really care, honestly, but it gets your attention. But it really is that simple and straightforward. And so that's an early lesson in this class. Accept it for what it is. Stop trying to make it what you assume it is. We all do that. You're going to have the hardest problem on a test. The biggest problem that any of you will have with passing this test is reading what's actually on the page versus what you're telling yourself you're reading on the page. When we get to agency, for example, you'll read a sentence that says, Travis is working with a buyer. And so I'll have you read that sentence to me. Travis is working with a buyer. And then I'll ask you a question. I'll say, who is Travis representing? And you know what you'll fire right back at me? Oh, he's representing the buyer. And I'll look at you and I go, and how do you know that? Well, it's what they said. No, it's not what they said. What did they say? He's working with the buyer. They said no such thing about he's representing the buyer. Can I work with a buyer while I'm representing the seller?
Yes.
But you made that wrong assumption when you read the first line of the question. Do you think that's going to have a big impact on the way you answer the rest of the question?
Yes.
Absolutely. So it's so much of this particular class is based in this idea of just taking it at face value sometimes. There are plenty of times when we have to dive deep, but a lot of these are just simply saying, okay, here are the pieces they've given me, the only way they fit together is this. So with a fee simple determinable deed, the only way they fit together is the grantor has told you what you can do with the property. And that restriction is going to sit there on that property for how long?
Forever.
Forever. No matter how many times it gets sold or transferred, for the rest of time, that restriction is going to sit there. The other way we can restrict use is something called fee simple subject to a condition. Fee simple subject to a condition is what you can't do with the property. Not what you can do, but what you can't do with the property. This is much less strict than what you can do. Because if I grant Aaliyah ownership of the property and say, Aaliyah, you own this property so long as you don't put a trailer park here. And whatever my reasons are, maybe I live next door. I don't want to be next door to a trailer park. What can Aaliyah do with the property? Anything else. Thousands of uses for that property, except what? A trailer park. And just like fee simple determinable, how long is that restriction going to stay around?
Forever.
Forever. Now, can she sell the property to somebody else?
Yes.
Yes. And is that somebody else going to have to honor that restriction?
Yes.
They sure are. Which one do you think is going to make it harder to market the property or sell it? The way I deeded ownership to Miriam, which is to say, Miriam, you can only use this property as a park. Or the way I deeded it to Aaliyah, which is to say you can do whatever you want as long as you don't use it as a trailer park. Which one's going to be more restrictive on that owner?
Part.
Miriam's is much more restrictive. Which property is going to have to be more valuable as far as being able to resell it? Aaliyah's is. Because a subsequent owner is going to see a lot more potential in Aaliyah's property than they are Miriam's, unless they just particularly want to own a park. Probably not going to be much interest in that one. Whereas with Aaliyah's, the sky's the limit. As long as they're not planning to operate a trailer park, they can do whatever else they want. Is everybody with me on that? Okay? So those are the use limitations. Fee simple determinable, fee simple subject to a condition. And then that just brings us back to that big chart. Hopefully, at this point, these make more sense now than they did when we first put that chart up yesterday. Yes, sir, Freddie.
And these statuses are all found in court.
Yes. If you wanted to know what kind of ownership someone has, you would go look at their deed at the county courthouse. You would go to the county courthouse in whatever county the property is located in. So like, for example, my house is in Cary. If you go to the Wake County Courthouse, you can pull up my deed. That's a public record. It's publicly available. You can see my deed. It is recorded at the county courthouse. If you go down there and you pull up my deed to my property with the grantor, so am I the grantor on that deed or am I the grantee on that deed? I am the grantee, right? Because that is when I was granted ownership of the property. Who would the grantor have been?
The seller.
The person that what? That sold it to me. The grantor on that deed is going to be the person who sold it to me. I am the grantee on that deed. And it will have on that deed the phrase, fee simple absolute ownership.
Okay.
It will specify right there on the deed what kind of ownership is being granted. And on my deed it says fee simple absolute ownership. It'll say something like, to have and hold all of the property known as, and it gives a legal description with the general warranty deed with fee simple absolute ownership. So that's a clear indication of what kind of ownership do I have. Fee simple. Fee simple absolute. Don't have any restrictions. Yes, ma'am, Mary. Does see your hand? You good?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
Have you ever filed to change it at some point? I mean, is it even
can I file to change what?
the ownership, not the ownership, the restrictions?
Who, all right, so you guys give me more information.
Okay, let's say, for example, if I was limited by a grantor as to what I could do with the land, is there
Yeah.
a way to, not to maybe say sue or to fight in court to them?
Well, you can always go to court, but what's the basic idea of an appurtenance? How long is it designed to last? Forever. So you'd have to make a case to the court why this thing which was designed to last forever shouldn't last forever. So I'm not going to say it couldn't happen because the court of law can do whatever they want to do. But now, my guess is you would have a fighting chance on a lawsuit like that if the restriction itself currently was a violation of law. You know, for example, if you were deeded the property fee simple determinable to only use it as a nuclear waste dump, that was the restriction on it. But the state won't allow you to operate a nuclear waste dump. You could probably sue to have that fee simple determinable restrict, because at that point, what can you do with the property? Nothing, right? And so that you might have a fighting chance about something like that. But just because you want the restriction lifted, probably not. Probably not. Okay, everybody good with that? Right? So, now that we've been through all of those, I want to take a minute and do a little game of sorts with you. And I want to pass these out. So, what I'm passing out now is a little packet of cards. And there are 7 cards in here, and they are the 7 types of ownership that we just went through. So they range from fee simple absolute to life estates pro rata v with a remainder interest, conventional life estates with a reversionary interest. We went through 7 different types of ownership. And so you have 1 card for each of the 7 in this packet. At the very back of the packet, you have 7 scenarios. Each one of these represents a separate one of these types of ownership. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pass these out, and you can unstaple them. Because what I want you to do is essentially shuffle your deck of cards and put them in the right order. You're going to use each one once and only once. what you're gonna find is that as you start working through them, something that you maybe thought one was earlier, you realize can't be because now you need it down here. And it's designed to make you engage with what we just went over so that you can help identify these on the test, okay? So I'm gonna pass these out. We're gonna take and we'll take, we'll say probably 10 minutes to give you, to go through these. So you can go ahead and start, just unstaple them. And I'll be wandering around, so as you have questions, you can flag me down. Sure. Some? Send them non-free.
I know they try to trick me, but there's questions where, all the answers seem right, but obviously, you're in one area, so.
Well, not necessarily. Some questions are phrased as, what's the best answer? Sometimes you'll get questions, what's the best answer? We got 4 right answers and one's better than the other 3.
Okay, and I know sometimes they throw like words that aren't terms used, so.
But leasehold just means non-freehold. So that's an estate, which is just a legal relationship. And the interest you have in the property, but you don't own it, you lease it. That's a
So that's the
leasehold.
same as a tenant.
That's a tenant. The tenant has a leasehold interest. The renter has a leasehold interest.
Okay,
Yep.
okay,
Whereas an owner has a freehold interest.
okay, okay. Thank you.
All right, y'all ready to take a look at them? Was it more challenging than you thought it might have been?
Yes.
Uh-huh. It's not so easy to apply these rules, right? And so this is the kind of the challenge of getting there, and again, just taking what they're saying and putting the pieces together. So let's look at the first one. It says, Travis wishes to deed a property over to Catherine with the stipulation that Catherine may not use the property for the purpose of establishing a hog farm at any time in the future. So here's how I would work through this progression. First of all, I would say, is it fee simple absolute? In other words, are there any restrictions? Are there restrictions?
Yes.
Yes. So since there's restriction, can you eliminate fee simple absolute?
Yes.
It's definitely not fee simple absolute. So if there's one gone. See how easy this is? You only got 6 left to choose from. There's one gone. Now, is the restriction based on time or is it based on use? Use. So we can eliminate all of the what? All the time-based. And what ones are time-based? Life estates. So all the life estates go away. So now we've eliminated down to how many?
4.
How many possibilities do we have left now?
4.
Just 2. Fee simple, determinable, and fee simple subject to a condition. Alright, so Is Catherine being told what she can do with the property or what she cannot do with the property?
Cannot do.
What she cannot. What one is that?
Conditional.
That is fee simple, subject to a condition, right? Fee simple, subject to a condition. I'll just put FSSC. My computer's not cooperating. Okay. Why did that? How'd you do on that one? You doing okay on that one? No? What'd you do? All right, fee simple determinable. So you did the right thing. You realized it was a restriction on use, right? So don't beat yourself up over you didn't get it right. Congratulate yourself that you got it down to a 50-50 shot. Does that make sense? What made you choose determinable versus subject to a condition?
I think when I looked at it, it said, I have here what I can do.
Yeah.
And I think I was thinking of it as I didn't read it.
Gotcha. Okay, that's fine. And so, again, make sure you just really are taking exactly what they say. She may not. She can't. Not what she can, but what she can. So that's fee simple, subject to a condition. Number 2, Yuchana is selling her family's farm to Bo, who will have ownership for a limited duration of time, and Yuchana has left provision that future ownership will end up in the hands of Christine. Bo's time of ownership will be limited based on his own lifespan. So it's a much longer one. Let's start with the same set of questions though. Again, process of elimination. Is it fee simple absolute? In other words, are there restrictions here? There are restrictions, so is it fee simple absolute?
No.
No. So we can eliminate fee simple absolute because there are restrictions. Are those restrictions based on time or are they based on use? Time. So that eliminates fee simple determinable and fee simple subject to a condition. What are we left with? There are 4 choices. All of the what? The life estates. So this is a life estate. Did everybody get to that point? This is a life estate. Okay, good. So, with a life estate, let's ask ourselves, who is the life tenant here? Who's the life tenant?
Bo.
Bo. Bo is the life tenant. And who is the measuring life? Bo. So if Bo is the life tenant and Bo is the measuring life, what kind of life estate do we have so far? Conventional. So now we're down to 2 choices. This is a conventional life estate, and the only other piece we need to know is, does it have a remainder interest or does it have a reversionary interest? So let's look at where it's going to go. It says, with a provision that future ownership will end up with Christine. Is that remainder or is that reversionary?
Remainder.
That is remainder. So this is a conventional life estate with a remainder interest. Okay? So conventional life estate with remainder.
Are we turning these packets back in?
No, they're yours.
Okay.
They're yours. I'm not stingy with paper. You get to keep it. That's why they're hole punch for you.
Thank you.
You can stick them in your notebook. Okay, so far, is everybody all right? Feel pretty good? Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
I had chosen per ultra V. Is that when they're the same?
Conventional is when they're the same person. When the measuring life and the life tenant are the same person. Pour ultra V means literally the translation for the life of another person.
Okay.
So a conventional life estate means the measuring life and the life tenant are the same person. Pour ultra V means they are 2 different people.
Okay, I think that's what
You just had them backwards?
Yeah.
Had them flip backwards in your mind? Good. Okay. Number 3, Omar has been gifted ownership of a property that will terminate upon his death. It's a short and sweet one. It's a short and sweet one. Start with the same set of questions. Is there a restriction here?
Yes.
Yes. So that eliminates what?
Fee simple.
Fee simple absolute. Fee simple absolute is eliminated because there is a restriction. What's the restriction? Is it time or use? time is limited here, so that leaves us with a life estate of some sort, right? So, we know it's a life estate. Who is the life tenant? Omar. Who is the measuring life? Omar. So what kind of life estate we have so far? Conventional life estate. And is this a remainder interest or is this a reversionary interest? Reversionary. Hopefully if you got number 2 right, you had to get this one right because you were only left with the reversionary interest. So this is a conventional life estate with a reversionary. Okay? So far so good? Number 4. Sammy's purchasing a hunting reservation in eastern North Carolina. The state of North Carolina has rules and regulations regarding the use of such premises, as does Edgecombe County, where the property is located. The grantor of the reservation makes these limitations clear to Sammy, who proceeds with the transaction anyway. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of words that actually gave no information at all. So I'm going to ask the same questions we asked before. Is there any restriction placed by the grantor?
Yes.
No.
No. There are restrictions, but where are they coming from? The state, the county. What did the grantor restrict? Nothing. And what do we call it when a grantor doesn't restrict anything? This is fee simple absolute. This is fee simple absolute. Because all the grantor did is said, hey, by the way, the state's got these restrictions on the property. The grantor didn't actually place any restrictions of their own. Is everybody okay with that? Number 5. Christina is gifting a parcel of land to her cousin for a time period that will end with the death of the cousin's oldest child. At the conclusion of this time period, Christina expects that ownership will return to her or her heirs. So, same set of questions. Is there a restriction here placed by the grantor? Yes, there is. So it's not fee simple absolute. Is it a time restriction or is it a use restriction? It's time, so we're at a life estate of some sort, right? We're down to the life estates. Who's the who's the life tenant? Her cousin, right? Right here. That's the life tenant. Everybody good on that? Who is the measuring life? The cousin's oldest child. Is that the same person or 2 different people? 2 different people. So what kind of life estate do we have so far? Life estate per ultra V. So measuring life tenant, 2 different people. Life estate per ultra V. Everybody okay? Now, what's going to happen to it at the end? Is it going to revert back? Or is it going to go to some named remainder man? Which one is it? It's going to revert back. This is a life estate per ultra V. So life estate PAV with reversionary. Number 6, Shanika has obtained ownership of a parcel of land which she's obligated to continue using for the purpose of a park if she wishes to maintain her freehold interest. Did the grantor place a restriction?
Yes.
Yes. Is it a time restriction or a use restriction?
Use.
It's a use restriction, so we're down to fee simple subject to a condition or fee simple determinable. Is she told what she can do or is she told what she cannot do?
What she
She is told what she can do. What one is that?
Determinable.
That is determinable. Fee simple determinable. And if you were 6 for 6 so far, hopefully you got the last one right. Process of elimination. Teresa inherited ownership of a home when her mother passed away. Teresa's mother had inherited ownership of the home for the duration of her sister Tammy's lifetime. Tammy is Teresa's aunt. It sounds like a Eastern North Carolina family tree here going on, by the way. And is still alive, although living in a nursing facility. Upon Tammy's death, ownership of the home will go to a charity located in Knoxville, Tennessee. This one's a tough one to sort through just because there's a lot of cousins and aunts and uncles. I did that because it should have been a process of elimination one, but let's just go through the questions. Is there a restriction placed by the grantor here?
Yes.
Yes. Is it time-based or use-based? It's time-based, okay? So that leaves us with a life estate. Who is the life tenant here?
The aunt?
Yeah,
Oh, no.
Her name is Teresa.
Teresa.
It was originally Teresa's mother, and now who is it?
Oh,
It's Teresa now, right? It was originally Teresa's mother, now it's Teresa.
yeah.
Life tenant. Who is the measuring life?
Tammy.
Tammy. No matter whether you figured it was Teresa or Teresa's mom that was a life tenant, the measuring life was always made clear that it was who? Tammy. And that's always clear that it was a separate person, so we've got a life estate what? Per Ultra-V. It's a life estate per Ultra-V. And is it going to revert or is it going to some named remainder person?
Remainder.
So this is a life estate per Ultra-V with a remainder interest. Did that help?
Yes.
Good. I think it does help to engage with them, to actually have to work and think your way through them, to understand these things. What kind of ownership are the vast majority of people going to have when they are granted ownership? Fee simple absolute. You could work your whole real estate career, folks, and not encounter one of these. But you've got to know them for the test. You'll learn that about this class. It's one of the frustrating things from my perspective in teaching the class is we spend so much time teaching you the exceptions to the rules. You know, we tell you, oh, fee simple absolute's awesome, and then we just move on like there was nothing else to say about it. Because we have to spend so much time on these little nitpicky things. But that's where the test questions come from. We're not spending all this time teaching you life estates because you'll probably deal with a bunch of life estates. I'm spending this amount of time because you need to be able to identify them on the test, because you will certainly see a test question. Now, of those 7, how many of them are inheritable? There's a different question. There's 7 different types of ownership there. How many of them are inheritable?
All except the conventionals. So 5.
5 of them. 5 of them. The only ones that aren't inheritable are the 2 that have the word conventional in front of them. Conventional life estates are not inheritable. That's a factoid you need to memorize. A conventional life estate is not inheritable. Every other form of ownership estate is inheritable. Is fee simple absolute inheritable?
Yes.
Yeah. Is fee simple subject to a condition inheritable?
Yes.
Fee simple determinable inheritable? Yeah. Life estates per Ultra-V, are they inheritable? Conventional life estates? No. It doesn't matter if they're remainder or they're reversionary, they're not inheritable. Because if you go back, just look at, all right, so number 2 was a conventional life estate. He said, Yuchan is selling her family's farm to Bo. Bo will have ownership until what happens? Until Bo dies, right? That was the deal in number 2. Bo's going to own it until Bo dies. Does everybody see that? Well, Bo's son stands to inherit his stuff when he dies. Except this property, what's going to happen to the ownership the minute Bo dies? It's going to go to the remainder interest, right? It's not going to be Bo's any longer. So there's no way Bo's son can inherit that thing because it's not there for him to inherit. So conventional life estates are not inheritable. Yes, ma'am, Mary.
When you say not inheritable, you're talking about not inheritable to the life tenant.
I'm talking about not inheritable. A life estate only exists while the measuring life is alive. Who owns the property while the measuring life is alive?
The grantor.
No,
the life tenant.
the life tenant.
Right.
So that ownership, the life tenant in a conventional life estate cannot leave that property as an inheritance to their heirs.
Right, but I guess that's what I was asking, like, they cannot inherit it to someone else, but the grantor can. Yes.
The grantor doesn't own it any longer.
But once that person is dead, they get
You talking about the remainder interest or the?
yeah, remainder of reversion.
What kind of ownership is that person going to have? What kind of ownership is that remainder interest or that reversionary interest going to have? Fee simple absolute. Is fee simple absolute inheritable?
Yes.
So answer, now put that all together, answer your own
Okay,
question. Can that future remainder owner or reversionary owner leave it as an inheritance? Can they? Absolutely, because they're going to own it fee simple absolute. That rule, we're not saying the property forevermore is not inheritable. We're saying the life estate itself, that conventional life estate, is not inheritable.
Ownership.
I got it.
The ownership is not inheritable for that one owner, that one life tenant. It's not inheritable for them. They can't leave it as something for their children to inherit it, because the instant they die, they don't own it anymore.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But the person behind them is not going to have that same restriction, so it would become inheritable for
Yeah,
them.
that's what I was trying to clarify.
Okay?
Thank
Better
you.
now? And it's good you ask that question, because that stuff gets murky in your mind when you start letting it swim around in there.
Yes.
It's like flood water. You don't know what's under the surface there till you dig in. We good? Yes, Francisco.
In the case number 4, even though that the grantor didn't put the limitation, the restrictions, buying a hunting reservation has itself a restriction, because you cannot cut the trees or you cannot kill the animal.
Right.
So there is a restriction in this kind of...
They're governmental restrictions, though. If they're not placed by the grantor, it's still considered a fee simple absolute ownership. The difference is where the restrictions come from. The fact that the restrictions come from the government or from some zoning regulations or some environmental protection regulations, it's still fee simple absolute, because fee simple absolute refers to the transfer from the grantor to the grantee. And for that transfer, it's fee simple absolute. Because if it wasn't, then we would never really have fee simple absolute. Pretty much, there's not a property left in this country you can buy that doesn't have some type of government-imposed restrictions on that property. If we looked at it that way, there would be no fee simple absolute. Okay?
Quick question. It gets kind of confusing because it says a grantor of the reservation makes a limitation. So if you kind of like...
Makes them clear.
Makes it clear, yeah.
It just makes them clear. In other words, he does his job and says, here are the restrictions that you're going to have to follow, because the government says you got to follow them.
Okay.
Here's the key difference there. Could those government restrictions change at some point in the future?
Of course, yeah.
Absolutely, and that's why it's still fee simple absolute, because every subsequent owner is going to be able to do whatever is legally allowed with that property. So if the law changes, can they change with the law? Whereas if the grantor was placing that restriction, how long would that restriction last?
Forever.
Forever. And that's the big difference there.
So what would be the key word that we're looking for when we see the word grantor?
It would say the grantor places the restriction, or the grantor enforces a restriction.
Okay.
Yeah, those would be, the grantor is taking some active role in putting the restriction there.
All right. Right here, he's not doing anything at all.
He's not doing anything. He's just saying, by the way, these are the rules.
Okay.
I had to follow them. You got to follow them too.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Those restrictions would be considered impertinent with a contingency only with law.
That's right. That's exactly right. You know, you still got to follow.
There may be a change.
That you got to follow the law. The appurtenance is that you have to follow the law.
Okay.
It's sort of like zoning regulations. If somebody buys this building, we have to make it clear to them what the property can be used for under the current zoning regulations. But the understanding is, the unspoken understanding, that if those zoning regulations change, you have to change with them. Whether they change in your favor or against you, you're going to have to go with the flow, because those are government restrictions, and I, as the grantor, have nothing to do with them. I'm just telling you what they are.
Yep. Got it.
Okay? Good questions. Real good questions. Jesse's like, what the hell did I walk into, man? You know, he comes into life estates first thing. I feel bad for the poor guy.
Yeah, I got 4 of them right.
You got 4 of them right. That's pretty dang awesome for just walking in the door, man. I like that. Okay? How we feel about it?
You really thought about making this question.
Oh, I tried to make it, especially the fee simple absolute one, right?
Okay.
It's not that I'm evil. I promise I'm not. It's that they are. The people who are making the test, they really are. They're lovely people on a personal level, but when they sit down and they try to make these tests out, they try to make them as obtuse as possible. You know, they never tell you anything directly. It's like, lead me through this winding path and then expect me to find my way home. And so what I'm trying to do is duplicate the way they would say things so that you get in the habit of seeing it that way.
Yeah, it will get simple.
Yeah. Okay? Good, good. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and we have not remotely finished chapter 2 yet, but I feel like you probably need a little short break. So let's take a little short coffee, restroom break. Be back in 10 minutes and we will pick it back up in chapter 2. Leslie's in her office. Just want to get her to do it for you.
I had a book house, I still wait for my.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, just yeah, Leslie's in her office.
Okay.
She'll do it for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Jesse, if you've got your ID, I will go ahead and check you in.